The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace, as tourists began gathering for the changing of the guard ceremony. Among them stood 15-year-old Sarah Mitchell, clutching her camera with trembling hands. This was her first trip to London, a birthday gift from her grandmother who had saved for months to make this dream come true. Sarah had always been fascinated by the royal family and their history. Her bedroom walls back home in Manchester were covered with postcards and pictures of the palace, and she had read every book about the monarchy she could find in the local library. Now, standing just meters away from the palace gates, she could hardly believe she was really there. The young girl had arrived early, hoping to get the perfect photograph of the guards in their iconic red uniforms and tall black hats. She positioned herself near the front of the crowd, her heart racing with excitement. The other tourists chatted in various languages around her, but Sarah was focused entirely on the moment when the ceremony would begin. As she adjusted her camera settings, Sarah noticed a man standing slightly apart from the main crowd. He was tall and thin, wearing a dark jacket despite the warm weather. Something about him made her feel uneasy. Though she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was, the man kept glancing around nervously, and his eyes seemed to focus on her more than once. Sarah tried to shake off the uncomfortable feeling and concentrate on why she was there. She had promised her grandmother she would bring back the most beautiful pictures of the palace and the guards. Her grandmother, now too frail to travel, had visited London as a young woman and often told Sarah stories about the majesty and grandeur of the royal ceremonies. The crowd grew larger as the ceremony time approached. Sarah found herself being pushed closer to the palace gates as more people tried to get better viewing positions. The nervous man in the dark jacket had somehow moved closer to her as well, though she tried not to think about it too much. Standing at his post near the palace entrance was Sergeant James Harrison, a 28-year-old guard who had served the royal family for 6 years. James took his duties seriously and had never once broken protocol during his service. He stood perfectly still, his rifle held at attention, his eyes scanning the crowd with practiced precision. James had joined the guard after serving in the military overseas. He found peace in the routine and discipline of palace duty, and he took great pride in being part of such an important tradition. The tourists always seemed so happy and excited, and though he couldn't show it while on duty, James enjoyed being part of their special memories. On this particular morning, however, something felt different to James. Years of military training had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now those instincts were telling him to pay extra attention to the crowd. His eyes moved methodically across the faces of the tourists, looking for anything out of the ordinary. That's when he noticed the man in the dark jacket. The man's behavior was odd. He kept checking his watch and looking around anxiously. More concerning was how he seemed to be focusing on one particular tourist, a young girl who was standing near the front of the crowd with a camera. James had seen all types of people during his time on duty. Most tourists were harmless, excited visitors who just wanted to experience a piece of British history. But occasionally there were individuals who raised red flags. The man in the dark jacket was definitely setting off alarm bells in James's mind. The girl appeared to be alone, which made James even more concerned. She looked to be in her early teens with light brown hair pulled back in a ponytail and wearing a simple blue dress. She seemed completely absorbed in preparing for photographs and appeared unaware of the man who was watching her so intently. As the minutes ticked by, James found it increasingly difficult to maintain his rigid posture while keeping an eye on the suspicious man. Protocol demanded that he remain completely still and focus straight ahead, but his protective instincts were screaming at him to act. The man in the dark jacket began moving through the crowd, getting closer to the young girl. James watched as the man positioned himself just a few feet behind her, pretending to look at the palace but clearly focused on the teenager. The man's hand kept moving to his jacket pocket, as if checking for something important. Sarah was completely unaware of the danger developing behind her. She was adjusting her camera lens and checking the lighting, determined to capture the perfect shot when the guards began their ceremony. The excitement of the moment had made her forget all about the uncomfortable feeling she had experienced earlier. Other tourists continued to arrive, making the crowd denser and more chaotic. James realized that if something was going to happen, the confusion of the crowd would provide perfect cover for someone with bad intentions. The man in the dark jacket seemed to be waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. James's training told him to follow protocol and alert his superior through proper channels, but his gut told him there might not be time for that. The man was now standing directly behind the young girl, and his behavior was becoming increasingly agitated. James could see the man's hand clenched in his jacket pocket, and his breathing appeared to be getting faster. The moment of decision was approaching rapidly. James had spent years following orders and protocols without question, but now he was faced with a situation where following the rules might mean allowing harm to come to an innocent person. The weight of his responsibility as both a royal guard and a human being pressed down on him as he watched the scene unfold. In just a few minutes, the changing of the guard ceremony would begin, and the crowd would become even more distracted and chaotic. James knew that whatever was going to happen would likely happen then, when everyone's attention was focused on the spectacle and away from the people around them. The young girl adjusted her position slightly, still completely unaware that danger was lurking just behind her. James made a split-second decision that would change everything that followed. The sound of drums in the distance signaled that the changing of the guard ceremony was about to begin. Sarah's heart raced with anticipation as she raised her camera, ready to capture the moment she had dreamed about for years. Behind her, the man in the dark jacket checked his watch one final time and slowly reached into his pocket. James watched in horror as the man's hand emerged from his jacket, holding what appeared to be a small knife. The blade glinted in the morning sunlight, and James realized that his worst fears were about to come true. The man was positioning himself to attack the young girl, using the distraction of the ceremony to mask his actions. Without thinking, James broke from his rigid position and shouted a warning. His voice cut through the excited chatter of the crowd like a sword, causing heads to turn in confusion. The tourists weren't sure what was happening, but the urgency in James's voice made it clear that something was very wrong. "Get away from her!" James yelled as he rushed toward the crowd, his heavy boots pounding against the cobblestones. The other guards at their posts looked on in shock, unsure whether to maintain their positions or follow James's lead. Breaking protocol during a ceremony was unthinkable, but James's actions suggested a real emergency. Sarah spun around at the sound of the shouting, her camera nearly slipping from her hands. For a moment she was confused about what was happening. Then she saw the man behind her, saw the knife in his hand, and felt her blood turn to ice. The realization of how close she had come to danger hit her like a physical blow. The man with the knife panicked when he realized he had been spotted. Instead of abandoning his plan, he lunged forward toward Sarah, desperate to complete his attack before anyone could stop him. Sarah screamed and stumbled backward, trying to get away, but the crowd made it difficult to move quickly. James was still several meters away when the man made his move. Time seemed to slow down as James pushed through the startled tourists, knowing that every second counted. He could see the terror in the young girl's eyes and the determined look on the attacker's face. Other tourists finally realized what was happening and began screaming and running in all directions. The orderly crowd quickly dissolved into chaos as people tried to get away from the danger. Some ran toward the palace gates, while others fled toward the street, creating a panic that made it even harder for James to reach Sarah. The attacker raised his knife, preparing to strike at Sarah, who had fallen backward onto the ground in her attempt to escape. She looked up at her attacker with wide, frightened eyes, unable to move fast enough to avoid what seemed inevitable. James reached the edge of the crowd and realized he wouldn't make it in time. In desperation, he did something that went against every bit of his training as a royal guard. He raised his ceremonial rifle and fired a warning shot into the air. The loud crack of the gunshot echoed off the palace walls and stopped everyone in their tracks. The man with the knife froze for just a moment, startled by the gunshot. That moment was all James needed. He launched himself through the remaining crowd and tackled the attacker just as the man was bringing his knife down toward Sarah. James and the attacker crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs, with James using all his strength to control the man's knife hand. The attacker was smaller than James, but seemed driven by a desperate fury that made him surprisingly strong. They rolled across the cobblestones, each struggling for control of the weapon. Sarah scrambled away from the fight, her dress torn and her hands scraped from falling on the rough stones. She pressed herself against the palace gates, watching in terror as the two men fought just meters away from her. Other tourists continued to flee, but some brave souls stayed to help or call for additional security. The other royal guards finally abandoned their posts and rushed to help James subdue the attacker. It took 3 of them to finally wrestle the knife away and pin the man to the ground. He continued to struggle and shout incoherently, his face twisted with rage and frustration at being stopped. James stood up slowly, breathing heavily from the fight. His perfect uniform was torn and dirty, his hat lost somewhere in the struggle. For the first time in his career, he had broken protocol, fired his weapon, and abandoned his post. But as he looked at Sarah, who was shaking but unharmed, he knew he had made the right choice. Palace security and London police arrived within minutes, having been alerted by the gunshot and the chaos in the crowd. They quickly took the attacker into custody, while paramedics checked on Sarah for any injuries. She was physically unharmed but clearly shaken by how close she had come to serious harm. The ceremony area, which had been so perfectly organized just minutes before, now looked like a disaster zone. Tourist belongings were scattered across the ground, and the carefully maintained order of the royal guard had been completely disrupted. The changing of the guard ceremony was cancelled for the first time in decades due to a security incident. James found himself surrounded by his superior officers, who were trying to understand what had happened and why he had broken protocol so dramatically. He explained what he had observed and why he felt compelled to act, but he knew that his career as a royal guard was likely over. The commanding officer, Colonel Williams, listened to James's account with a stern expression. Breaking protocol was a serious offense, and firing a weapon during a ceremony was almost unthinkable. However, as the details of the situation became clear, Williams began to understand that James had prevented a tragedy. Sarah's grandmother arrived at the palace within hours, having been contacted by the police. She rushed to her granddaughter's side, tears streaming down her face as she realized how close she had come to losing the most precious person in her life. Sarah fell into her grandmother's arms, finally allowing herself to cry about the frightening experience. News reporters began arriving at the scene, drawn by reports of gunshots and an attack near Buckingham Palace. The story was already spreading across social media, with tourists who had witnessed the events sharing their own accounts and videos of what had happened. As the immediate crisis passed, everyone involved began to realize that this incident would have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. The police station was bustling with activity as detectives worked to piece together the events that had unfolded at Buckingham Palace. The attacker, who had been identified as 32-year-old Michael Thompson, sat in an interview room refusing to speak to anyone. His silence only added to the mystery of why he had targeted a young tourist. Detective Inspector Rebecca Hart was assigned to lead the investigation. She had dealt with many cases involving threats to public safety, but an attempted attack so close to the royal family's residence was particularly serious. As she reviewed the initial reports, she realized that this case would require careful handling due to the high-profile nature of the location. Meanwhile, James found himself in an uncomfortable position. While everyone agreed that he had likely saved Sarah's life, the fact remained that he had broken several important protocols. He sat in Colonel Williams's office, still wearing his torn and dirty uniform, waiting to learn his fate. "Sergeant Harrison," Colonel Williams began, his voice measured and serious, "what you did today was both heroic and completely against regulations. I'm not sure I've ever faced a situation quite like this one." James straightened in his chair. "Sir, I understand the seriousness of breaking protocol, but I couldn't stand by and watch that girl get hurt when I had the power to prevent it." Colonel Williams studied James for a long moment. "The royal family has been briefed on what happened. They want to meet with you personally to discuss the situation." This news surprised James. In his 6 years of service, he had never had direct contact with the royal family beyond ceremonial duties. The thought of explaining his actions to them directly made him nervous, but he knew he had to face whatever consequences awaited him. Sarah and her grandmother were staying at a hotel near the palace while the police investigation continued. Sarah hadn't been able to eat much since the incident, and she kept replaying the terrifying moments in her mind. Every time she closed her eyes, she could see the knife coming toward her. "I should have been more careful," Sarah told her grandmother, guilt weighing heavily on her young shoulders. "I should have noticed something was wrong with that man." Her grandmother, Margaret Mitchell, held her granddaughter's hand tightly. "You did nothing wrong, dear. You were just trying to enjoy your trip and take some pictures. That terrible man is the only one to blame for what happened. Detective Inspector Hart arrived at their hotel that evening to interview Sarah about what she had observed before the attack. Sarah tried her best to remember every detail, but the trauma of the experience had made some memories fuzzy. Did the man say anything to you before the attack? Detective Hart asked gently. Sarah shook her head. No, he never spoke to me at all. I just noticed him watching me and it made me feel uncomfortable. But I thought I was being silly. The detective made notes and assured Sarah that her instincts had been correct. Trust your feelings about people, she advised. If someone makes you uncomfortable, there's usually a good reason for it. Back at the palace, preparations were being made for James's meeting with the royal family. This was not a typical situation covered by standard protocols, and palace officials were unsure exactly how to handle it. The incident had already made international news, and the palace was under pressure to respond appropriately. The next morning, James was escorted to a private room in the palace, where he waited nervously for the royal family to arrive. He had changed into a fresh, clean uniform, but he still felt the weight of his actions from the day before. When the door opened, James was surprised to see not just one member of the royal family, but several. They entered with warm smiles rather than the stern expressions he had expected. James stood at attention, unsure of the proper protocol for this unprecedented situation. Sergeant Harrison, the senior royal family member, began. We want to personally thank you for your quick thinking and brave actions yesterday. You prevented what could have been a terrible tragedy. James felt a wave of relief wash over him. Thank you, Your Majesty. I was just doing what I felt was right. Sometimes doing what's right means breaking the rules, another family member added.
Your instincts and training served you well.
Even if your methods were unconventional. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with the royal family asking James about his background, his military service, and his thoughts on palace security. They seemed genuinely interested in his perspective and grateful for his actions. Meanwhile, the investigation into Michael Thompson was revealing disturbing information. Detective Hart discovered that Thompson had been following various tourists around London for several weeks, apparently looking for a suitable target. Sarah had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Thompson had a history of mental health issues and had recently lost his job and apartment. His family hadn't heard from him in months, and they were shocked to learn about his attempted attack. The investigation revealed that he had been living on the streets and had become increasingly unstable. The media coverage of the incident continued to grow, with news outlets around the world reporting on the royal guard who had broken protocol to save a young tourist. Social media was filled with praise for James's actions, and many people were calling him a hero. Sarah's story was also gaining attention, with many people expressing sympathy for what she had endured and admiration for her bravery. Interview requests were pouring in from television shows and newspapers, but Sarah and her grandmother had declined all of them, preferring to maintain their privacy. At the police station, Detective Hart was preparing to charge Thompson with attempted assault and carrying a weapon in a public place. The evidence was overwhelming, and Thompson's continued silence wasn't helping his case. James returned to his quarters that evening, emotionally exhausted from the day's events. His fellow guards welcomed him back with a mixture of concern and admiration. Some worried about the precedent his actions might set, while others praised him for potentially saving a life. Colonel Williams called another meeting with James to discuss his future with the Royal Guard. The conversation that had started with potential disciplinary action had taken a completely different turn after the royal family's intervention. The royal family has made it clear that they consider your actions commendable, Colonel Williams explained. However, we still need to address the protocol violations for the sake of maintaining discipline. James nodded, understanding that there had to be some consequences for his actions regardless of the outcome. He was prepared to accept whatever punishment was deemed appropriate. The colonel continued. After much discussion, it has been decided that you will receive a formal reprimand for breaking protocol, but you will also receive a commendation for bravery and quick thinking. Additionally, your insights about security will be valuable as we review our procedures. This outcome was better than James had dared to hope for. He would be able to continue his service while also helping to improve security measures to prevent similar incidents in the future. 3 weeks after the incident, Sarah was back home in Manchester, but the experience had changed her in ways she was still trying to understand. Her bedroom, once filled with cheerful pictures of the royal family and palace, now felt different somehow. The images that had once brought her joy now reminded her of that terrifying morning. Her friends at school had seen the news reports and treated her like a celebrity at first, asking endless questions about what it felt like to be attacked and rescued by a royal guard. But Sarah found it difficult to talk about the experience, and eventually her friends learned to give her space. Sarah's mother, Janet Mitchell, had taken time off work to help her daughter process what had happened. She noticed that Sarah was having trouble sleeping and seemed jumpy whenever strangers approached her in public places. Janet decided it was time to seek professional help for her daughter. Dr. Emily Watson was a counselor who specialized in helping young people deal with traumatic experiences. During their first session, Sarah sat quietly in the comfortable office, unsure of where to begin. "It's normal to feel confused and scared after what you went through," Dr. Watson explained gently. "Your brain is trying to process something that was very frightening and unexpected." Sarah finally spoke up. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if that guard hadn't been there. What if he hadn't noticed that man watching me?" Dr. Watson nodded understandingly. "Those what-if thoughts are very common after a traumatic event. But it's important to remember that you are safe now, and you survived because someone was paying attention and chose to help you." Back in London, James was adjusting to his new role as both a royal guard and an unofficial security consultant. The palace had asked him to work with security experts to review and improve their protocols for protecting both the royal family and the public during ceremonies. The experience had given James a new perspective on his duties. He realized that protecting people wasn't just about following rules and procedures, but also about being aware, thinking quickly, and sometimes making difficult decisions in the moment. James had received hundreds of letters from people around the world, thanking him for his actions. Many of the letters came from parents who were grateful that someone had protected a child who could have been their own daughter. Reading these letters helped James understand the broader impact of what he had done. One letter in particular stood out. It was from Sarah herself, written in careful handwriting on pale blue stationery. She thanked him for saving her life and told him that she hoped to visit London again someday, though she wasn't sure when she would feel ready for that. Detective Inspector Hart had completed her investigation into Michael Thompson's background and motives. The picture that emerged was of a man who had gradually lost touch with reality due to untreated mental illness and difficult life circumstances. Thompson had been evicted from his apartment 3 months before the attack and had been living in parks and shelters around London. Witnesses reported that he had been acting strangely and talking to himself frequently. Several people had tried to help him, but he had refused all offers of assistance. The detective's report revealed that Thompson had been carrying a notebook filled with rambling writings about tourists and foreigners. His thoughts had become increasingly disconnected from reality, and he had apparently convinced himself that attacking a tourist would somehow solve his problems. During one of her therapy sessions, Sarah asked Dr. Watson about forgiveness. "Should I feel sorry for the man who tried to hurt me? Everyone says he was sick and couldn't help what he did." Dr. Watson considered the question carefully. It's possible to understand that someone was struggling with mental illness while still acknowledging that what they did was wrong and frightening. You don't have to forgive him right now or ever if you don't want to. Your feelings about what happened are valid regardless of his circumstances. The royal family had been following both Sarah's recovery and James's integration into his new responsibilities. They decided to do something unprecedented to show their support for both the victim and the hero of the incident. A formal invitation arrived at the Mitchell family home, requesting that Sarah and her grandmother visit the palace for a private tea. The invitation explained that the royal family wanted to personally ensure that Sarah was recovering well and to thank her for her bravery during a difficult situation. Sarah's first reaction was fear. The thought of returning to the palace brought back vivid memories of the attack, but her grandmother encouraged her to consider it carefully. "It might be exactly what you need to help you move forward," Margaret suggested. "You could see that the palace is a safe place again, and you could meet the people who were so concerned about your well-being." After discussing it with Dr. Watson, Sarah decided to accept the invitation. The therapist thought it could be a positive step in helping Sarah reclaim her sense of security and control. James was also invited to attend the tea, giving him an opportunity to meet Sarah in person for the first time since the incident. He was nervous about the meeting, wondering if seeing him might bring back traumatic memories for the young girl. The day of the tea arrived with unseasonably warm weather and clear skies. Sarah wore a new dress that her mother had bought specially for the occasion, and she carried a small gift for the royal family to thank them for their kindness. When Sarah and her grandmother arrived at the palace, they were escorted through private entrances away from the public areas where tourists gathered. Sarah felt her heart racing as they walked through the elegant hallways, but the peaceful atmosphere helped calm her nerves. James was already in the tea room when Sarah arrived, and they looked at each other uncertainly for a moment. Then Sarah walked over to him and simply said, "Thank you." James felt emotional as he looked at this brave young girl who had endured so much. "I'm just glad you're okay," he replied. "I've been thinking about you and hoping you were doing well." The royal family joined them for tea, creating a warm and comfortable atmosphere that put everyone at ease. They asked Sarah about her interests and her school, treating her like an honored guest rather than focusing on the traumatic incident. During their conversation, one of the royal family members mentioned that they had been in touch with Michael Thompson's family. "They wanted us to know how sorry they are about what happened, and they're grateful that no one was seriously hurt." Sarah listened thoughtfully to this information. She wasn't ready to think about forgiveness yet, but knowing that Thompson's family cared about what had happened somehow made the situation feel less frightening and more human. The tea lasted for 2 hours, and by the end, Sarah was laughing and chatting comfortably with everyone. When it was time to leave, she hugged James goodbye and thanked the royal family for their kindness. "You'll always be welcome here," they assured her. "This is a safe place, and we hope you'll come back and visit us again." As Sarah and her grandmother left the palace, Sarah realized that something important had shifted inside her. The palace was no longer just the place where something terrible had almost happened. It was also the place where people had cared enough to protect her and check on her recovery. 6 months after the incident, James received news that would change his life once again. He was called to Colonel Williams's office, where he found several high-ranking officials waiting for him. The serious expressions on their faces made James wonder if he was in trouble again. "Sergeant Harrison," Colonel Williams began, "your actions that day and your work on security improvements have not gone unnoticed at the highest levels. We have a proposition for you." James was offered a position with an elite security unit that worked directly with the royal family during public appearances and travels. It was a significant promotion that would allow him to use his protective instincts while serving at the highest level of his profession. This position would require additional training and a complete background review, one of the officials explained. "But your proven ability to think quickly under pressure and your willingness to put others' safety first make you an ideal candidate." James was honored by the offer, but asked for time to consider it. The new role would mean leaving his current unit and the familiar routine of palace duty. It would also mean taking on greater responsibility and more dangerous assignments. That evening, James called his sister Emma, who lived in Scotland with her family. He had always been close to Emma, and she was one of the few people who truly understood his dedication to his work. "You saved that girl's life," Emma reminded him. "If you have a chance to save more people by taking this new job, shouldn't you at least consider it?" Emma's words helped James realize that he had found his true calling. Protecting people wasn't just his job anymore. It had become his purpose. Meanwhile, Sarah was making remarkable progress in her recovery. Dr. Watson had helped her develop coping strategies for dealing with anxiety and intrusive thoughts about the attack. Sarah had even started a self-defense class, which helped her feel more confident and in control. The self-defense instructor, Maria Santos, was impressed by Sarah's determination and focus. "She has a natural awareness of her surroundings that many people lack," Maria told Sarah's mother. "What happened to her was terrible, but she's turning it into strength." Sarah had also become involved with a local charity that helped victims of crime. She volunteered to stuff envelopes and help with fundraising events, finding that helping others who had been through similar experiences gave her a sense of purpose. One day, Sarah received an unexpected phone call from Detective Inspector Hart. The detective had been following up on the case and had some news about Michael Thompson's situation. "I thought you might want to know that Mr. Thompson has been receiving treatment for his mental illness while in custody, Detective Hart explained. His doctors say he's making progress, though he still has a long way to go. Sarah listened quietly to this update. She had been thinking more about Thompson's situation lately, especially after her conversations with Dr. Watson about mental illness and responsibility. Is he sorry for what he did? Sarah asked. Detective Hart paused before answering. His doctors say that as his condition improves, he's beginning to understand the gravity of what he attempted. He's asked if there's any way he could apologize to you, though everyone understands if you're not interested in that. Sarah told the detective she would think about it. The idea of facing Thompson was both terrifying and oddly compelling. Dr. Watson had mentioned that some victims found closure through controlled contact with their attackers, but only when they felt truly ready. James had decided to accept the promotion and was beginning his advanced training program. The work was challenging and demanding, requiring him to learn new skills in threat assessment, crowd control, and emergency response. During one training exercise, James found himself thinking about Sarah and wondering how she was doing. He had heard through palace contacts that she was recovering well, but he often thought about the brave girl who had faced such a terrifying situation with such dignity. James's new training partner was Rebecca Chen, an experienced security officer who had worked protection details around the world. She was curious about the incident that had led to James's promotion. Breaking protocol to save someone takes real courage, Rebecca told him during a break in their training. A lot of people would have hesitated or waited for orders. James appreciated her perspective, but he still sometimes wondered if he had done the right thing. What if I had been wrong about what I saw? What if I had caused panic for nothing? Rebecca shook her head. But you weren't wrong. Trust your instincts. They've served you well so far. Back in Manchester, Sarah was preparing for an important milestone. She had decided she was ready to return to London for a visit. This time, however, she wouldn't be going as a tourist. She had been invited to speak at a conference about crime victims' rights and recovery. The invitation had come through the charity she volunteered with. They thought Sarah's story of survival and healing could inspire other young people who had experienced trauma. Sarah was nervous about speaking in public, but Dr. Watson encouraged her to see it as an opportunity to take control of her narrative. You get to decide how your story is told, the therapist explained. That's a powerful thing. Sarah spent weeks preparing her speech, working with her mother and Dr. Watson to find the right words to express her experience and her journey toward healing. She wanted to be honest about the fear and difficulty she had faced while also showing that recovery was possible. The night before her trip to London, Sarah had trouble sleeping. She kept thinking about returning to the city where she had faced her worst fear, but she also thought about James, the royal family, and all the people who had shown her kindness during her darkest moment. James, now several weeks into his new position, heard about Sarah's upcoming visit through his contacts at the palace. The royal family had mentioned that they planned to attend her speech, and James asked if he could be part of the security detail for the event. Colonel Williams approved the request, understanding the personal significance of the assignment for James. It will be good for both of you to see how this story continues to unfold, he said. The conference was being held at a hotel in central London, not far from Buckingham Palace. Sarah arrived the day before her speech, accompanied by her mother and grandmother. They stayed at the same hotel where they had stayed after the incident, but this time the atmosphere was completely different. Sarah felt nervous but also proud as she walked through the hotel lobby. She was no longer a victim hiding from the world. She was a survivor with something important to share. The morning of the conference, Sarah woke up early and spent time reviewing her speech one final time. She had practiced it dozens of times, but she wanted to make sure she could deliver it confidently, even if she became emotional. As she got dressed in a professional blue suit that made her feel mature and confident, Sarah thought about how much her life had changed in less than a year. The frightened girl who had almost been attacked at the palace had grown into a young woman with a voice and a mission. The conference room was filled with counselors, social workers, police officers, and other people who worked with crime victims. Sarah felt the weight of their attention as she was introduced, but she also felt supported by their presence. When Sarah began to speak, her voice was clear and strong. She told her story simply and honestly, describing both the terror of the attack and the long process of healing that had followed. She spoke about the importance of having people who believed in her recovery and supported her journey. As Sarah concluded her speech at the conference, the audience rose in a spontaneous standing ovation. She had spoken for 20 minutes about her journey from victim to survivor, and her words had touched everyone in the room. Tears glistened in many eyes as people recognized the courage it had taken for her to share such a personal and difficult experience. James watched from his position near the back of the room, feeling proud of the remarkable young woman Sarah had become. When she had finished speaking, Sarah looked around the room and spotted him. Their eyes met across the crowded space and she smiled, a genuine, confident smile that showed how far she had come. After the formal conference ended, Sarah was surrounded by people who wanted to thank her for sharing her story. Counselors told her that her words would help them better support their own clients, and several young people in the audience said her story had given them hope for their own recovery journeys. The royal family members who had attended approached Sarah with warm congratulations. They had watched her grow from a traumatized teenager into a confident young advocate, and they were clearly moved by her transformation. "You've turned something terrible into something meaningful," one of them told Sarah. "That takes tremendous strength and character." Later that afternoon, Sarah, her family, and James were invited to have tea together at a quiet cafe near the conference hotel. It was the first time they had been able to talk privately since that day at the palace months earlier. "I've been following your progress through mutual friends," James told Sarah. "I'm incredibly proud of how you've handled everything that happened." Sarah looked thoughtful as she stirred her tea. "I've been thinking a lot about that day lately. Not just the scary parts, but also what came after. How many people stepped up to help me?" She turned to James. "You broke the rules to save me. The royal family made sure I felt safe and cared for. Dr. Watson helped me understand my feelings. My family never gave up on me. I realized that for every bad person in the world, there are so many more good people." James felt moved by her perspective. "You've taught me something important too. I used to think my job was just about following orders and maintaining discipline. But that day showed me that sometimes the most important thing is to act on your instincts when someone needs help." Sarah's grandmother, who had been quietly listening to their conversation, spoke up. "I think you were both meant to be there that day. Not for the terrible thing that almost happened, but for what grew out of it afterward." As they talked, Sarah mentioned something that surprised everyone. "I've been thinking about writing a letter to Michael Thompson." The adults at the table exchanged glances, concerned about this development. Sarah's mother was the first to speak. "Sweetheart, are you sure that's something you want to do?" Sarah nodded slowly. "Dr. Watson and I have talked about it a lot. I'm not ready to meet him or anything like that, but I think I want him to know that I'm okay, and that I hope he gets the help he needs." James admired Sarah's compassion, but he also worried about her safety. "Have you talked to Detective Hart about this? There might be legal restrictions about contact." Sarah assured them that she would work through proper channels if she decided to move forward with the letter. "I just feel like holding on to anger isn't helping me heal anymore. I don't have to forgive him, but I also don't have to let what he did control my life." Over the following weeks, Sarah did write a letter to Michael Thompson, working with Dr. Watson and Detective Hart to ensure it was appropriate and safe. The letter was brief and carefully worded, expressing that she was recovering well and hoped he would get the treatment he needed to get better. Thompson's response, which came through his attorney and therapist, was also brief. He expressed remorse for his actions and gratitude that Sarah had not been seriously hurt. He didn't ask for forgiveness or make excuses for his behavior, which Sarah appreciated. "It doesn't change what happened," Sarah told Dr. Watson after reading Thompson's response, "but somehow it makes it feel more finished, if that makes sense." James's new career was flourishing. His unique combination of military training, protective instincts, and real-world experience made him valuable for high-profile security assignments. He had worked several royal events and had been commended for his professional growth and leadership abilities. One evening, James received a call from Sarah. She was now 17 and preparing for university applications. She wanted to study social work or counseling, hoping to help other people who had experienced trauma. "I wanted to ask you something," Sarah said. "My school is doing a career day, and I wondered if you would come speak about your work. A lot of students are interested in law enforcement and security careers." James was honored by the invitation and agreed to visit Sarah's school. When the day arrived, he found himself standing in front of a classroom full of teenagers who were eager to hear about his experiences. "The most important thing I've learned," James told the students, "is that your job is not just about following rules or procedures. It's about using your training and judgment to protect people and make the right decisions, even when those decisions are difficult." One student asked if he ever regretted breaking protocol to help Sarah. James considered the question carefully before answering. "I regret that the situation happened at all," he said, "but I don't regret my response to it. Sometimes doing the right thing means being willing to face consequences for your actions." After his presentation, Sarah walked James to his car. "You know," she said, "I used to have nightmares about that day. But now when I think about it, the first thing I remember isn't the scary man with the knife. It's you running to help me." James felt a lump in his throat as he realized the profound impact their brief encounter had on both their lives. "You've helped me too, you know. You showed me what real courage looks like." As they said goodbye, Sarah handed James a small wrapped package. "This is for you," she said. "Something to remember that good things can come from difficult situations." Inside the package was a framed photograph that Sarah had taken on a recent visit to London. It showed the palace gates where they had first met. But instead of tourists crowding around, the image captured a moment of quiet beauty, with soft morning light illuminating the historic building. On the back, Sarah had written, "Thank you for showing me that there are always people willing to help. Your friend, Sarah." Years later, both James and Sarah would look back on that terrible day as a turning point that led them to their true purposes in life. James continued to serve in high-level security positions, eventually becoming a trainer who taught other officers about the importance of situational awareness and decisive action. Sarah became a licensed counselor specializing in trauma recovery for young people. She often shared her own story with clients who were struggling to see beyond their immediate pain, showing them that healing and growth were possible even after the most frightening experiences. They stayed in touch over the years, meeting occasionally for tea when Sarah visited London or when James's work brought him to Manchester. Their friendship had been forged in a moment of crisis, but it had grown into something deeper, a reminder that even the worst moments in life can lead to unexpected connections and positive change. The incident at Buckingham Palace became a case study in security training programs, showing how quick thinking and willingness to break protocol when necessary could prevent tragedy. But for James and Sarah, it remained something much more personal, the day they learned that courage, compassion, and human connection could triumph over fear and violence. Their story continued to inspire others who heard it, proving that heroes can emerge from ordinary circumstances and that survivors can transform their pain into purpose. In the end, what had started as a moment of terror became a testament to the power of human kindness and the importance of people who are willing to stand up for others when it matters most.